Hello everyone and welcome here. My name is Caitlin Sutton and I'm a curator here at the Allport Museum. I acknowledge and pay respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and traditional owners and continuing custodians of this land on which we gather today, and acknowledge elders past and present. Well, welcome to this series of talks that we are having, which are being held during the Lanney Pillar exhibition. This is the first of 4, and we welcome questions and discussions at the end of each. As a cultural institution, the library, we respectfully acknowledge the lasting trauma experienced by Palawa Tasmanian Aboriginal people that has resulted from the actions of Morton Allport, W.L. Crowther and other individuals in the name of scientific research. Before I introduce our speaker today, I would just briefly like to play a clip for you about our current exhibition, as it will help to contextualise this talk.
As Aboriginal people, we've always talked about, the people up on those brass statues. What do they represent?
I hope that we can remove the life of William Lanne from under what some of us know about him, from under that story of his death and his mutilation by William Crowther.
We've got a way to go, but I think it's having things like this that starts that very small thing in our minds to think about where we're going as a country and how we're maturing as a country.
So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Stefan Petrow, who is familiar to many of you. He was also my lecturer at uni. He is known around the archives in this building for his absolutely meticulous research. As it happens, in 1997, he wrote an article about William Lanne and William Crowther and was kind enough to agree to give a talk on the subject today. From 1980 to 1999, Stefan worked at the UTAS Library, mainly as a law librarian, and then in special collections, with responsibility for the Royal Society Library, government publications and rare books. From 2000, Stefan taught Tasmanian, Australian and European history at UTAS. And in June 2020, he was Emeritus Professor of History. His main areas of research have been in legal history, with a particular interest in policing history, urban history, and town planning and cultural history. So please join me in welcoming Stefan Petrow today. Thank you for being
here. Thank you all for coming. Clifford's got to do some work, so I'll just make 3 brief points. As mentioned, the research for this talk was for an article that was published in 1997. About 25 years ago. It's got nothing to do with the current issues. It was written and arose out of my research on policing history that Caitlin mentioned. So I was looking at the municipal police, and I came across this incident, affair, scandal, horror, many words could apply. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute when I talk about. The second thing is I have had a cough for about 2 weeks, so if my voice conks out, I've got an offer of reading what I've written out, but I hope that doesn't eventuate. And the third thing, which brings us closer to the talk, is that I believe that the historical imagination thrives in the devil of the micro-historical detail. You say, well, I know the Lanney story. Well, you know the outlines of it, but unless you've read my article, and has anyone read the article in Aboriginal history, and some have, you'll know that there's far more to it than just the obvious. And so that's what I'm trying to get at with this particular, And so the microhistorical detail is what I'm interested in. I think it does help us to feel what it was like to be there at the time. I tend to want to reproduce what people said at the time rather than impose myself on it, because it is about history after all. But the wider context is important, and for those who've read the article, you know I do touch on the wider context. So let's get started. In 1869, William Lanne, the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal male, died. Lying in the morgue of the Hobart Town General Hospital, his dead body was mutilated by scientists competing for the right to secure the skeleton. The first mutilation, by Dr. William Lanne Crowther, removed Lanne's head. The second mutilation, by Dr. George Stokell and others, removed Lanne's hands and feet. After Lanne's burial, Stokell and his colleagues removed Lanne's body from the grave before Crowther and his party could do the same. Lanne's skull and body were never reunited. They were guarded jealously by the respective mutilators in the interests of science. By donating Lanne's skeleton, Crowther wanted to curry favour with the prestigious Royal College of Surgeons in London, while Stokell, anxious to retain his position as house surgeon at the General Hospital, wanted to cultivate good relations with the powerful men associated with the Royal Society of Tasmania. But perhaps because of the scandal associated with the mutilation, no scientific study of Lanne's skull or skeleton was ever published or, as far as we know, even attempted. It seems that Lanne was mutilated to satisfy the egos and personal ambition of desperate men who wanted a memento of Tasmania's last man, as the newspapers of the time called him, and in fact, I'll have a quote where Lanne called himself the last man. Lanne's mutilation could be seen as symbolising the dispossession of land from the Tasmanian Aboriginals and its carving up by racially intolerant and violent white settlers, generally indifferent to the rights of the Indigenous population. Furthermore, it illustrated the hegemony scientific knowledge sought to establish over fundamental human rights, such as a decent burial, even for a member of a supposedly inferior people who was officially categorised as a Protestant. Most writers on the Lanne affair relied on the account of one newspaper, the Hobart Town Mercury. There are at least two problems with this approach, which justified my study of the Lanne affair. First, the Mercury has been uncritically accepted as the voice of public opinion for a long time. The Mercury reflected, though, the essentially conservative and idiosyncratic opinions of its owner, John Davies, the ex-convict and member of the House of Assembly. But in 1869, some 9 other newspapers were published in Tasmania and all had something to say about Lanne's death. In some cases, the editorial view followed the Mercury's line of demonising Crowther as the main offender, as indeed he was. Other newspapers, however, supported Crowther and directed acerbic comments at Stokell and his supporters in the Royal Society of Tasmania. All the papers published many letters from readers and thus provide us with a more varied response than can be gained just from reading the editorials and help us to penetrate the thicket of innuendo, rumour and allegation that surrounded the affair. The second problem with accounts of the Lanne affair is the tendency to recount, following the Mercury, the events surrounding the mutilation of his body and the desecration of his grave as simply a story of scandal. So today I'll be widening the angle of vision and considering in more detail a number of issues raised by Lanne's mutilation. One issue, given inadequate attention in previous writing, was the extent to which Tasmanians at the time reflected on the guilt and shame of their past treatment or the past treatment of Aboriginals. But arguably, anger at Lanne's indignity had little to do with his Aboriginality or his status as the last full-blooded male Aboriginal. After spending his early years in the company of Aboriginal people, Lanney ultimately decided to adapt to white society, and in particular, the close-knit whaling community of Hobart Town. Tasmanians were therefore concerned that what happened to Lanney as a resident of Hobart Town could happen to them. They strongly reacted to the unregulated and indiscriminate dissection of bodies in the hospital. In fact, the head of a dead white man had been decapitated and substituted for Lanney's. Public criticism of the management of the hospital resulted in Tasmania's first Anatomy Act being passed in 1869 to provide some protection for dead bodies. Tasmanians denounced the practice of body snatching and asserted the right of everyone to be buried without the fear of later interference with their grave. They questioned whether scientists, however allegedly important the reason, were justified in flouting the law and the moral standards of the community. Important as these reactions were, perhaps the crucial dimension of the Lanney affair was political. Lanney's mutilation made such a great impact on society, not because he was the so-called last man, but because of the political situation in 1869. William Crowther was a political opponent of the Dry government, which used Lanney's mutilation as an excuse to discredit Crowther. In many ways, the most interesting point is how Crowther struggled to avoid the Dry government's attempts to punish him politically and professionally for mutilating Lanney, and what these struggles tell us about the morality of public men in the period. Crowther was a scientist as well as a politician, and his commitment to science impelled him to mutilate Lanney's body. Why were scientists interested in Aboriginal skeletons? Well, spirited debates by ethnologists, comparative anatomists, archaeologists and others on the origin of the human race occurred in Britain in the first half of the 19th century. Dividing people into races and studying their physical similarities and differences became a popular field of study. And from these studies, it was thought possible to rank the races, to draw conclusions about their chances of survival, and to establish how close some races were to animals. Remote and so-called inferior people, such as the Tasmanian Aboriginals, attracted growing interest. Political economist and demographer Thomas Malthus identified the Tasmanian Aboriginals as second from the bottom of the scale of human beings. Scientific theories nourished a racist ideology that purportedly explained the superiority of Europeans over the Indigenous population, which, because of its moral and intellectual inferiority, was on its way to extinction. Now, we don't know for sure, but when Europeans settled in Van Diemen's Land in 1803, between 5,000 to 7,000 Aboriginals were living there. The census of the 31st of December 1861 recorded the existence of 2 males and 6 females, although a considerable number of so-called half-castes lived in the Bass Strait Islands. For the purposes of racial science, half-castes were useless and were ignored. Racial scientists required bodies or parts of bodies in a fit condition and of a high racial purity to underpin the certainty of their findings. After Charles Darwin published on the origin of species, hang on, what we got? Oh, sorry, can you see? Can you read that? It's not very good, is it? In 1859, we find a remarkable upsurge of interest in the morphological and anatomical investigation of the Australian and Tasmanian Aboriginals in an effort to discover vital evidence for comprehending human evolution. As there was immense prestige to be won by contributing to original knowledge in the field of human evolution, Aboriginal bodies were much sought after. And of all the body parts of interest to scientists from the early 19th century, the most crucial was the skull. which was measured to show that Tasmanian Aboriginals had smaller, less developed brains than other people, and proved they were the missing link between ape and man. Indeed, in 1863, T.H. Huxley, Darwin's close friend, sometimes called Darwin's bulldog, referred to Aboriginal skulls as proof of Darwin's theory of evolution. Well, such confident pronouncements were based on the relatively few skulls housed in British museums, and scientists were anxious to acquire more specimens. That would not be easy. As one collector noted in 1874, Tasmanian Aboriginal skulls were rare objects and were not held in anything like abundance. Tribal custom was important here. Some tribes placed skulls in holes in the ground and covered them with leaves and dirt. Other tribes burnt their dead and thereby contributed to the scarcity of skeletons. In the late 1860s, the rarity of Aboriginal skeletons, the applications of evolutionary principles to human history, and William Lanne's status as the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal male gave his death much greater significance to the scientific community than his life ever had. But what about his life? What about his life? What do we know? Well, let's have a summary of it here. One of 5 children, William Lanne, and you can see the spelling is slightly different. I've used it as E for my article, but there are other ways of spelling it. Was born at Coal River, we think, in about 1835, spent time on Flinders Island from about 1842 before being taken to the Queen's Orphan Asylum on the 28th of December 1847. Here he was partly educated. According to one account, he wrote a fair hand, read well, and was said to be intelligent. Lanney received some religious teaching and was designated as a Protestant. In January 1853, he was apprenticed to William Rumney, a farmer at Clarence Plains on the eastern side of the River Derwent. After leaving Rumney, he eventually found his way to the Aboriginal community at Oyster Cove, where Lanney was regularly taken out on whalers and acquired a partiality for seafaring life. Aboriginals were valued by whaling masters for their great power of vision and were employed as mast headsmen. Lanney sailed with the Aladdin and later the Runnymede whaling ships. To his fellow sailors, Lanney was known as King Billy. He was popular, being regarded as a good-natured, jolly fellow and an amusing companion. Some contemporaries painted a less ebullient picture. Dr. Joseph Milligan, the last so-called protector at Oyster Cove, thought Lanney was a very docile boy and youth and was stupid and dull of apprehension. Attempts to teach him religious principles were a signal failure. Well, these different perceptions can be reconciled. No doubt, Lanney felt comfortable and happy with his sailing companions, but was less inclined to communicate or cooperate with the authorities, who, after all, had presided over the decline of his people. Views differed on other matters. According to one account, Lanney was not particularly proud of his ancestry. The evidence for this is slight. When his portrait was taken by Charles Woolley for the International Exhibition in 1866, Lanney disliked the photograph, intimating that it was too black for him. Other evidence, however, indicates that he was proud of his Aboriginality. In 1864, after complaining that rations for the Oyster Cove settlement were too low, Lanney told Colonial Treasurer Charles Emeritus that, quote, "I am the last man of my race and I must look after my people." Lanney was very popular with the Aboriginal women at Oyster Cove, Lanney with his ladies, and those ladies described him as fine young man, plenty beard, plenty laugh, very good, that fellow. Lanney did not produce any children. Unlike most whalemen, though, he did marry Truganini, one of many husbands of Truganini. Oh, that's not quite right. A bit ahead of my time there. a much older Aboriginal woman. Despite his links with the remaining Aboriginals, Lanney probably felt more comfortable at sea and carousing in pubs with his sailing companions than living at Oyster Cove. On the 4th of March 1868, Lanney boarded the Runnymede for a long voyage. He returned, as was described, fat and unhealthy in February 1869. After receiving his wages, Lanney lodged at the Dog and Partridge pub, which I suppose people of a certain age would remember going back, a popular haunt in his day for whalers, prostitutes and other low-class Hobartians. And in my day, university students tell the difference. There, Lanney enfeebled his constitution by indulging his propensity for beer and rum. He fell ill and was supplied with medicine from Thomas Smart's dispensary. After a week, he contracted choleric diarrhoea and received medical treatment for another week. On the 3rd of March, while dressing to go to hospital, Lanney died. As an honorary medical officer at the General Hospital, Crowther, Dr. Crowther, obtained a coroner's order and sent the body to the institution's dead house, which now brings us to the part of the mutilators and the body snatchers. So I want to give you that chronology of what happened before I go into the issues that raised by it all. So William Crowther, I'm sure you know what he looks like by now, but that's him, had long been desperate to obtain an Aboriginal skeleton to send to Sir William Flower, curator of the Royal College of Surgeons, Hunterian Museum. By design, Crowther co-owned land adjoining the Oyster Cove settlement. In 1862, his co-owner, Henry Harrison Pybus, offered to take responsibility for the Aboriginals at Oyster Cove for £500 and to look after them on his property. This would have given Crowther prime access to the bones and skulls he so coveted, but the government refused, thinking £500 too much. Lanney's death provided Crowther with his last opportunity, and he asked the Premier and Colonial Secretary Richard Dry for the skeleton. A member of the Royal Society Council that Caitlin mentioned, Morton Allport, had already contacted Dry with the same request. So they're haggling over this skeleton. In October 1866, Crowther had topped the poll for the seat of Hobart Town, but resigned from Parliament when Dry refused to include him in the ministry. Perhaps trying to win back an acidulous political opponent, Dry now graciously put it to the Royal Society Council that you may find it not incompatible with the interests of our local institution to waive your claim to Lanney's skeleton in Crowther's favour. However, the Royal Society, which had close links with the government and received an annual government grant of £5,000, asserted that its right to the skeleton of the last male Aboriginal of Tasmania was altogether paramount to any other scientific institution in the world. But the Royal Society admitted the claims which science in general had upon these valuable relics, so it intended to photograph the skeleton on a large scale and present copies to the museum of the Royal College of Surgeons and other interested institutions. Casts of especially interesting parts of the skeleton would also be provided. This was a strong assertion of authority by the oldest colonial scientific body against its metropolitan counterpart, represented in Hobart Town by the overblown arrogance of William Crowther. But whatever his inclinations, Dry, a deeply religious man, wanted to give Lanney a Christian burial before agreeing to the Royal Society's request. Well, aware of the anxiety of Crowther and the Royal Society to secure an Aboriginal skeleton, on the 4th of March, Dry instructed Dr. George Stokell, the recently appointed house surgeon, not to permit any mutilation of Lanney's body. After telling the steward and storekeeper, Charles Seeger, and the attendant, James Ware, at the hospital of Dry's instructions, Stokell met Crowther in the street. And this part becomes really strange. Crowther told Stokell that Dry had given him Lanney's body and he intended to have it. Stokell countered with Dry's instructions that the body should not be touched or mutilated. Crowther then invited Stokell to his house. Stokell foolishly accepted this transparently suspicious invitation and arrived at Crowther's house at the agreed time of 8 p.m. Crowther was absent, but Mrs. Crowther kept Stokell talking for some time. Stokell finally left and arrived at the hospital at 9 p.m. He discovered that Crowther and his son Bingham had spent nearly an hour at the hospital. Stokell entered the dead house to find that Lanney's skull had been removed and had been replaced by the skull of a white man whose body had been placed in the adjoining dissecting room. So, remembering Dry's promise to the Royal Society, Stokell told its secretary, Dr. James Agnew, of the mutilation. Agnew consulted two other members, Morton Allport and J.W. Graves. They decided to prevent the mutilators from getting the rest of Lanney's body by cutting off his hands and feet and hiding them in the Royal Society's museum. It seems that Dry knew nothing of this mutilation, which was against his instructions, and it is unclear when he was told. Well, Dry appears himself not to have made plans to bury Lanney and left this responsibility to Captain James Bailey, owner of the Runnymede. At the request of Graves, a well-known friend of the remaining Aboriginals, Lanney's funeral was held at 2 p.m. on Saturday, the 6th of March, to allow the attendance, they announced, of all the colonists who desired to show some outward token of respect for the last male Aboriginal Tasmanian. Lanney's coffin was covered with a black possum skin rug as a symbol of the Aboriginal people. On the rug was placed two native spears and waddies, around which were twined the ample folds of a Union Jack, specially provided by the shipmates of the deceased. The pallbearers were Captain Hill of the Runnymede and three coloured seamen, John Bull, a native of the Sandwich Islands, Henry Wally, a half-caste native of Kangaroo Island, South Australia, and Alexander Davidson, an American. The chief mourners were Captain MacArthur of the Aladdin and Captain Bailey. Other mourners included almost all the masters of vessels in port, numerous members of the whaling fraternity, the Mayor James Milne Wilson, many old colonists and native-born Tasmanians. As the funeral party moved along Liverpool Street and into Murray Street to St David's Church, it gathered strength and was followed by a large concourse of spectators. Reverend Frederick Holdship Cox read the church service. Up to 120 mourners left the church for St David's burial ground, St David's Park, in Davey Street, where Cox read the second part of the impressive burial service of the Church of England. Word of the mutilation had spread. Indignant at so unwarrantable desecration, prominent citizens demanded that Dry exhume the body for examination. Dry proposed that the grave be guarded until Monday morning, when an inquiry would proceed, and two municipal police constables were so deployed. There was a different kind of police force that Dry was in charge of, but they chose municipal police. But late on Saturday night, police were ordered to leave the graveside, and soon after, Lanney's body was removed. At 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, the gravedigger discovered the coffin and blood on the ground. Traces of blood allegedly stopped at the gate opposite the stores of the Anglo-Australian Guano Company in Salamanca Place, in which Crowther had an interest. At 9:30 a.m. on the 8th of March, Dry sent for Alfred Kennelly, chairman of the hospital board and a member of the Royal Society Council, and they questioned various members of the hospital, Seeger, Weir and Dan, the hospital's barber. All testified to the presence of Crowther and his son in the dead house between 8 and 9 on the day that Lanney's head was cut off, although they could not say for certain that they were carrying anything when they left. Dry acted on this evidence of Crowther's guilt. He instructed Kennelly to suspend Crowther as honorary medical officer until he could satisfactorily explain the points raised in the evidence. Dry also wrote to Crowther asking him why he had, prima facie, ignored the instructions not to mutilate Lanney's body. The hospital board also withdrew permission for Crowther's son to study at the hospital. All the letters written to and by Crowther and the evidence given at the inquiry were published in the newspapers in an attempt to damage Crowther's reputation. Well, anxious to find Lanney's body between 4 and 5 p.m. on the 8th of March, Crowther arrived at the hospital gate with his son. He would not be denied, this man. Superintendent of Police Richard Propsting and a number of others were with him. Crowther forced his way into the hospital and headed for the old infirmary. Stokell arrived and ordered Crowther to leave. Crowther responded by hammering in a panel of one of the wards and forcing the door's lock. Finding masses of fat and blood, which he assumed to be Lanney's, but no bones, Crowther and his party left. Crowther made no effort to explain his actions, but later, in a letter to the press, accused Stokell of removing Lanney's head, contrary to all the evidence. As Colonial Secretary, Dry was also responsible for the General Hospital, and he decided to appoint a fuller board of inquiry into the circumstances attending Lanney's mutilation to discover when and by whom such mutilation was effected. The chairman was the Recorder of Titles, William Tarleton, who had previously been Police Magistrate of Hobart Town, and a couple of old public-spirited colonists. Crowther declined to appear before the board as evidence had already been taken and published by the government ex parte and judgment pronounced against me in the matter. Stokell denied cutting off the head but admitted removing Lanney's hands and feet. Stokell's weak justification was that as Dry had given Lanney's body to the Royal Society, he was not acting against Dry's orders. Dry was determined to keep Crowther on the defensive. To test Crowther's allegation that Stokell was the guilty party, the government prosecuted Stokell for removing Lanney's head. The case was heard at the police court before Mayor Wilson, JP, who was associated with the Dry government, and not before a stipendiary magistrate who would hopefully be more impartial and independent. Crowther was examined by the prosecutor, Chief District Constable Alfred Jones, and Stokell's Defence Counsel, Solicitor General R.P. Adams. Crowther conceded little and declined to answer any questions about his role, if any, in the affair on the grounds that he might incriminate himself. The government, in other words, failed to trick Crowther into admitting his complicity or guilt. But as no evidence was found to incriminate Stokell, the mayor dismissed the case. Satisfied with the evidence taken by Tarleton and given at the police court, Dry ended the inquiry, as Crowther had refused to explain why he violated the order not to mutilate Lanney's body, and as he tried to induce the public to believe Stokell was responsible. Dry felt justified in dispensing with Crowther's services at the General Hospital. Crowther refused to be bound by Dry's instructions, but Dry dismissed his protests. 1,200 of Crowther's supporters petitioned the government to reinstate him, claiming that the evidence was unreliable and that the poor and sick needed Crowther's services. He had a reputation for looking after the poor of Hobart. Dry and the hospital board stood firm relenting only to allow Crowther's son to recommence medical studies if an honorary medical officer was willing to take him on as a pupil. Well, that's what happened. Clearly, you know who the guilty parties were, but what debate went on in the wider society about this whole affair, because it was obviously made big news at the time and affected people emotionally at the time. Well, of course, a whole lot of institutions are involved in this, aren't they? The hospital, the police, the government, the Royal Society, the management of St David's Cemetery. It also prompted consideration of moral issues of more relevance to Tasmanians of the late 1860s than the demise of the Aboriginal population. But the Lanney affair did cause some Tasmanians to reflect on their past and present attitudes and present attitudes to Aboriginals. European views on the treatment of Aboriginals had always been deeply ambivalent, and such was the case in 1869. According to the anonymous correspondent to the newspapers, going under the name of Job Muggs, but in actual fact, the Irish Catholic spy called J.D. Balfe, it's another story altogether, we could have another talk about that sometime. According to him, a large portion of society still regarded Aboriginals with far less consideration than they are accustomed to bestow upon their dogs or cattle. Few cared, claimed Muggs, that Aboriginals had suffered robbery, murder and rape and numerous other indignities since first settlement. No surprise then that shameless atrocity perpetrated on Lanney's body was viewed by the religious community with comparative indifference and with the rest of the population merely laughing at what had happened. And certainly you can find evidence if you go to the newspapers of the humour was involved. There was one response. There was ridicule in poems published in the newspapers, and it's all there. Well, most of them are there. Not all are digitised, but most of them are. Some enterprising souls tried to cash in on Lanney's death. On the 16th of April, an advertisement announced the display of a complete full-size bust of Lanney by the artist Francisco Sante, which Hobartians could see for a small sum. In June 1869, advertisements in the Launceston's Cornwall Chronicle melodramatically contained just the words, "Look out for King Billy." On the 2nd of July, it became clear that the words referred not to Lanney's resurrection from the dead, but to King Billy's sheepwash tobacco. One writer has suggested that the title King Billy was a joke in itself, signifying a partially domesticated animal who could imitate European behaviour and was harmless and amusing. An alternative interpretation could see it as an affectionate nickname and a joke which the good-humoured Lanney shared. Well, certainly Tasmanians made more fuss about Lanney after his death than when he was alive, as a Crowther supporter, Charles Dowdall, noted. So, quoting him here, "Did Lanney have a friend while knocking about the streets tipsy, when he travelled wanting, when he died? Ignored by the government and the Royal Society, Lanney's only true friend was Captain Bailey, who put his hand in his pocket and given the money to bury poor Billy," claimed Dowdall. Bailey, a wealthy man, was certainly not Lanney's only friend, as the number of seamen who attended his funeral showed. Ships contained numerous black seamen from all over the world, and Lanney probably built strong friendships amongst that modestly paid and close-knit community. But apart from any respect he might have had for a good seaman or his responsibility as captain to bury a dead crew member, possible explanations for Bailey's benevolence might be guilt or shame. The Tasmanian Times thought that many colonists probably regretted, perhaps with compunction, the extirpation of the original occupants of Tasmania. British views on the affair were also a consideration. The colonists had already attracted infamy by failing to provide for the comfort and protection of these unhappy victims of advancing civilisation. The Lanney affair, thought the Tasmanian Times, lowered us at once to the level of savages and would attract further opprobrium from foreign critics. The Mercury stressed the numerous cruelties that Aboriginals suffered at the hands of depraved men. Not only dispossessed of their land, their children were taken away and their women were treated most shamefully by ruffians. The Leader, more obscure newspaper, also expatiated on the Aboriginals' long tale of suffering and oppression. Alcohol and tobacco introduced by colonists, the lawless and licentious violence of bushrangers and shepherds, and the guns of convict constables helped destroy the Aboriginal people. Government policy consummated the exterminating policy of the early settlers. Aboriginals were first placed on bleak and barren Flinders Island and then transferred to an unhealthy swamp at Oyster Cove, where they died off like rotten sheep. Thus, the government dealt with a difficult social problem and saved much public expenditure. Under this onslaught, the extinction of the Aboriginals was assumed to be inevitable because they made it inevitable, tried to. Throughout the Lanney affair, no mention was made of the offspring of sealers and Tasmanian Aboriginal women living in the Bass Strait Islands. Little thought was given to Lanney's wife, Truganini, at St David's, not a very good photograph of St David's Cemetery. The Leader did note how the feelings of the poor survivors at Oyster Cove have been cruelly wounded by the indignities to which Lanney's body had been subjected. Feeling very low-spirited since hearing on the 13th of March 1869 of her husband's death, Truganini considered that she had been treated cruelly by the authorities because she had not been allowed to attend Lanney's funeral and believed she should have been given a mourning dress. When she heard of Lanney's mutilation, she vowed that nothing would induce her to become an inmate of the hospital where she might be treated as he was after death. Well, as Tasmania was probably the only place in the world able to boast of burying the last male Aboriginal, Charles Gaylor proposed some slight memorial in honour of that eventful occasion. If 2,000 residents contributed 2 shillings and sixpence, £250 could be raised. The response to Gaylor's proposal was mainly positive. A native correspondent to the papers thought that more than £250 could easily be raised to erect an historical and substantial record of the demise of the last Tasmanian male Aboriginal. The memorial would show the world that in Tasmania, not only the last remains of Europeans are respected, but also those of every other creed and country, from the Chinese down to the poor black Aborigines. Put in this way, the memorial might be read as symbolising the triumph of a superior civilisation over a supposedly inferior people. But for another correspondent, Half Crown, the memorial would have a more noble purpose. It would make amends for the wrongs our ancestors inflicted upon Aboriginals and would mark their extinction by some public recognition of their former inheritance of this, their own kingly empire. The other side of the view was expressed by KPX, who regarded Gaylor's proposal as a grim jest. Raising money for a memorial would only draw attention to the scandal that should be covered up under a veil of oblivion rather than by perpetuating the miserable story via monument. Even if Tasmanians built the best monument we may, we can only preserve the memory of our disgrace, not atone for it. Shame prevailed as no monument to Lanney was built. Well, based on views expressed in newspapers, few condoned Lanney's mutilation or removal of his body from the grave, and the way the graveside had been left by two competing parties of resurrectionists. In England, body snatching for dissection or any other purpose had traditionally aroused intense opposition across classes. In Tasmania, the willful neglect of cemeteries had attracted public criticism in the 1860s, but the desecration of Lanney's grave raised public indignation to no ordinary pitch. According to the Mercury, this response showed that the common people have a better appreciation of decency and propriety than such of the so-called upper classes and men of education. Such men had perpetrated a flagrant outrage from which the greatest ruffians in Tasmania's worst days would have shrunk. If the offenders were not punished by law, they should be socially ostracised by making them marked men, targets for the finger of scorn. And of course, there was criticism, mainly from the Cornwall Chronicle, that the government should have taken far greater precautions to stop the desecration of the grave, so foul and barbarous a sacrilege. The act would have, thought the Chronicle, a most pernicious influence on the morals of the people. It would teach citizens to treat with contempt the rites of Christian burial. The consensus was that the offenders should be punished. The Examiner believed that Tasmanians were opposed to the emergence of a race of body snatchers and supported their severest repression. And then there was discussion, was money going to be made from sending the skeleton and the skull to England? Was in fact Lanney really a full-blooded male? The Examiner thought the scientists were hopeless. They'd miscalculated. Lanney had been born and bred in civilization, and therefore his skeleton would not be the exact type of his race. The Examiner suggested that digging up appropriate sites on Flinders Island would supply plenty of skeletons to satisfy scientific societies of Europe if the business was discreetly managed. But, it's not just the European societies. The Royal Society of Tasmania deserves much condemnation. Their excuses for wanting the skeleton, their excuses for their members cutting off the body parts were justified by saying, but we will look after it in the interest of Tasmanians. It's our duty to do this as the main scientific society. Stretching the truth and no justification for mutilating Lanney's body. But just want to, I'm coming to the end, if you're wondering. Just want to say something about Muggs again, Joe Muggs, J.D. Balfe. He represented the sceptical side of Tasmanians about the claims of scientists. And he was close to the mark when he suggested that morbid curiosity rather than science motivated the mutilators and body snatchers. Equally curious and worthy of preservation, argued Muggs, was the effect of civilisation on the Aboriginals. The museum should therefore also contain the skeleton of the first white man who murdered a black one and debauched his gin, the first bullet and bayonet that sped the messages of death to the vitals of a native heathen, or the first piece of manufactured hemp that choked a poor wretch convicted of crimes he was ignorant of until taught them by the example of his European instructors. Here, satire effectively highlighted how colonial museums provided one-sided views of relations between colonists and Aboriginals and shaped perceptions of the colony's history. So I could say more about the police, I could say more about the hospital. I just want to say a little bit more about Crowther before concluding. So what happened to Crowther? Was he ostracised by society as it was said he should have been? No, he was elected to the Legislative Council, even though the Examiner said that the great majority of Tasmanians viewed his actions with the greatest repugnance. Did he miss out on getting anything from the Royal College of Surgeons in London? No. He got a gold medal for his valuable contribution to the Hunterian Museum, one of only 4 people at that point to have received it? Did he have to at least put up with Stokell staying in the hospital? No. Stokell's contract was not renewed, got removed, partly because the government, which was the Wilson government at that stage, said, oh, he's too inexperienced to be involved with the hospital, but probably to, punish him for Lanney's failure to protect Lanney's body. And of course, then Crowther goes on to have a political career. He's in a ministry. He's the first doctor to be Premier of Tasmania. He stays on in politics until 1885, very much in the public view. And of course, as we all know, there's a statue in Franklin Square that was erected in January 1889 at a cost of £770. So Crowther was not really affected by this whole affair. Of course, no memorial like that was erected for Lanney, which is part of the whole point of this exhibition in a way. But in a sense, Lanney did leave a memorial behind. In August 1869, William Dobson, Attorney General in the Wilson government, introduced the Anatomy Bill to regulate the practice of anatomy. Based on the English Anatomy Act of 1832, this rendered lawful a system which for so many years was unlawful. Said Dobson, it allowed legally qualified doctors and students licensed by the Colonial Secretary to practice anatomy, provided the relatives or executor of the deceased agreed and provided the deceased did not express his opposition to anatomical examination. A breach of the statute would result in 3 months' imprisonment or a £50 fine. So thanks to Lanney, the Anatomy Act 1869 protected future dead bodies from indiscriminate dissection in hospitals. So, as I said at the beginning, no scientific study of Lanney's skeleton. We still speculate about where the body parts are. No one knows for sure. There's evidence for this, there's evidence for that. No one knows for sure. But did Tasmanians learn anything from the Lanney affair when his wife Truganini, supposedly the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal, died in 1876? In the short term, the answer is yes. The Premier in 1876, Alfred Kennelly, and his government politely but firmly rejected 2 bids by the Royal Society for Truganini's body, expressing a desire to prevent a recurrence of the unseemly proceedings which occurred after Lanney's death. This time precautions were taken. At the hospital, the body was guarded by a constable. To foil the chances of body snatchers, the government departed from the funeral program announced in the press. Instead of burying the body at noon on the 11th of May, the government authorised the superintendent of the Cascades Jail, A.H. Boyd, to remove the body from the hospital at 11 p.m. on the 10th of May. Next day, Truganini was buried in a grave not far from the front door of the chapel, behind the walls of the jail, and secure from the intrigues of the body snatchers. Boyd was instructed not to permit the removal of Truganini's remains from the grave without a written order from the Governor in Council. But ultimately, the scientists did triumph. In December 1878, the Royal Society secured the control of Truganini's skeleton from the government of W.R. Giblin, one of our greatest, along with Andrew Inglis Clark, men of the 19th century, on the condition that it would not be exposed to public view, but be decently deposited in a secure resting place where it may be accessible by special permission to scientific men for scientific purposes. Did Giblin know he was about to lose office to William Crowther and act to frustrate his successor? Whatever the reason, the condition was broken in 1904 when the skeleton was placed on public display in the local museum, where it remained until 1947. Despite, again, many lofty pronouncements of its significance, Truganini's body, like Lanney's, was never the subject, as far as I know, others may know differently, of close scientific investigation. But unlike Lanney, Truganini's body was not mutilated. Her body was cremated, and true to her wishes, on the 1st of May 1976, the ashes were scattered over D'Entrecasteaux Channel, safe forever from the demands of ambitious, unscrupulous and immoral scientists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Are there any questions, comments? It's a lot to take in. Yeah, just want to recover. Oh, yes?
Just say, in further defence of Captain James Bailey and his older brother, Captain Charles Bailey, who both owned the Runnymede at the last ship that William Lanne served on. Yeah, I don't think, okay, there might have been a background guilt when they funded the funeral, but they did employ him and he was an extremely valued crew member. I read somewhere that he was actually a helmsman, and both Captain James and Captain Charles wrote letters. They were incredibly concerned about what had happened to him. So I'd just like to clear that because it wasn't just an act of guilt.
Oh no, I wasn't. I was saying, was it an act of guilt, or
Deeply perhaps, but they had. But as you pointed out, the Indigenous people, both of Tasmania and New Zealand and all over the place, were highly valued in the whaling industry. It was one of the few places where they could get employment and where they could get employment because they were strong and capable and brave.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned Stokell, the guy who took the act.
Yep.
He was sanctioned by the Royal Society at the time.
No.
He didn't, so he was doing it on behalf of them without their sanction. Yeah,
he conferred with them. Yeah, he conferred with them. Yeah, no, he was definitely. Agnew, of course, was by defending the Royal Society's right, was defending Stokell's right to do what he did because he was doing it for the Royal Society. That's how I would read it anyway.
Punished as a consequence, get trapped across.
Oh, he was sacked from the hospital. He didn't continue in the hospital. Partly, I think he was ineffective, but also partly, I think that was his punishment for doing what he did. But that's a government decision, not a Royal Society decision. I'm sorry, there's a black up with that.
Thank you, sir. Amongst other accounts of the mutilation subject burial. Our accounts that suggest that on discovery the body had been stolen from the grave with the remnant of it, and discarded European head that had been buried with him, subsequently found discarded on a nearby tombstone. Why did he go nearby tomb? Are there found the evidence for that?
I wasn't really looking for that. No, I think something like that might have happened. Yeah.
Asking out of curiosity.
Yeah, no, I can't help you on that one. Sorry.
And the second one I looked at you was that perhaps kudos might have been a huge driver of people like Crowther.
Oh yeah.
Desire for kudos from on high.
It was all about that, I think. Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, we talk about the Royal Society, and of course, the Royal Society of Tasmania in the 19th century, was the oldest. It had a journal. It published a lot of scientific papers. But there were very few people. Science was more of an amateur hobby back then. Not to say that there weren't some very impressive scientists, members of the Royal Society, but they weren't all. And whether they had the ability to do anything with the skeleton, that's why they wanted to send it back, send it to England. I doubt that they could have done anything to further Darwin's theories or anything like that. Sorry,
Was there a lot of activity in body snatching in Tasmania at the time? Sort of, I was just thinking perhaps the bodies of convicts, skulls of lower class Europeans?
I'm sure there was.
What do we know about that?
I don't know a lot, but I'm sure there was a lot of that sort of thing. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I suppose the part that upset people was that it's in a place where you would expect the body to be respected. It's not dug up, from a grave, and they're still doing all these terrible things to those body parts, and that could be anybody's family member in there. And I think that's why the Anatomy Act served its purpose, because it said, well, we're not saying you can't do it, but you better ask, the relatives or whoever first.
Thank you.
You mentioned that Truganini ashes were gathered in the channel in the 60s, but her skeleton was on display in Teagnag or in the Tasmanian Museum until the end of the 40s, I think.
47, I think.
47.
Yeah.
So she still had that public
voyeurism. Yeah. I mean, trying to think about how Truganini must have felt about it all, not being allowed to go to the funeral, hearing how it happened, worried, sick. I mean, she was an older, older than Lanney, could end up in the hospital with illness. I mean, she must have felt terrible about all this. Must have, been a very emotional time for her.
You mentioned Crowther's got a gold medal from this.
Royal College of Surgeons, yeah.
Sorry. Was that as a consequence of providing people?
Well, I think, this is what we're not sure about, but he was sending other body parts back as well. They even got some of the governors involved. People would contact the governor. I think Gore Brown was one governor that was contacted and said, could you keep a lookout for any Aboriginal body parts and send it on to us. So there was a market in this sort of thing. It was definitely a market, not just kudos.
Stokell end up sending the hands and feet to England?
Some people say yes. It's all a little bit hazy for me because there's so many, did it go to London? Did it go to Edinburgh? Did it stay here? Was it sent somewhere else? If we had really concrete evidence to say what had happened, I'd feel more comfortable. But yeah, I can't really say. Some people say yes, and some say parts of his body were made up into pouches, and all these things. There's so much rumour. Some people even said that he wasn't actually dead when they cut his head off. He was in a trance. This is what I'm saying about rumour. Rumour was thick on the ground at this time.
And also by that stage, they were trying to cover it all up. So that's
that's it.
The evidence as well.
Yeah, and so you send out other stories to hide that fact.